So firstly, what sort of book is it? I think I've already talked to this. It's a book for teachers. It's not a textbook. It's not a book you can give to students. It's for you. That's why I've written it. And I've structured around the PPDAC inquiry cycle. So each chapter is a phase or a stage of the cycle. It is heavily, from my perspective, focused on content knowledge. And so I'm trying to think about all the things that I might want to know about stats. And in fact, I use the book all the time. I have it sitting, if I'm developing resources or things like that, I constantly go to the book now that it's there. I don't have to go and find this stuff. I know it's in there. Well, I hope it is. And if it isn't, I go, oh no. I've done a lot of work around indicators and progressions. And I started that work in 2019 in February with a group of mostly facilitators in English and Māori medium, so Pāngarau and mathematics facilitators, to look at the progressions and the indicators that we would unpack the AOs for statistics. And then there's teaching ideas in there, and then there's some links to statistical literacy. So that's what's in the book. Now I'm going to have to move along, otherwise we're going to never get there. Okay, so it is designed for both Te Marautanga or Aotearoa and the New Zealand curriculum. And at the time of writing, the Te Marautanga curriculum was based on the English version. So there was a huge alignment, excepting that they had some stuff on ethics, which we didn't. And so that was great. It was a really big learning and growing area for us. And as I already said, based on the PPDAC cycle, and I'm just showing you there, if you haven't seen them, the two new posters that are on there. So this is the junior one and the senior one. And you'll see that the language is updated, and a lot of that is partly due to the work I've done in the book. Okay, so yeah. When I started writing it, I did a bit of a brain dump. I talked with people like Maxine and others to think about what stuff do we need to have in the book. And so this is the initial contents, if you like. And I look at what I've got and I think I'm not too far off it, actually. That this was my guide as I went along. So let's have a look at what's in the book. So each chapter has a very similar structure, and that was really key from the teachers that I worked with, was they want to know what's in there and they want it to be the same. They don't want every chapter to look different. So basically they have an introduction, which is just sets the scene for the part of the cycle. And then there's somewhere between 2 and 4 topics, and I'll show you them shortly. And within the topic, there's all this sort of background content information here. So that might be definitions, it might be an explanation of a concept, it might be something about the research we've done in New Zealand, or it might be a contextual example. It really just depended on what fitted best for the chapter, the phase of the cycle, and what was available in New Zealand. And then after each sort of content part, there's a progression, and the progression is trying to break down and say, this is roughly what you do at this age group, and this age group. And that was really important for me when I was writing the book, because what I want teachers to be able to do is think, oh, I'm working on, I don't know, data. I'm looking at data, just collecting data, and my students are doing this. So I can have a look and I can see, oh, they're actually working at year 7 level, or they're working at year 4 level. And so they can see within their class that kids are working at multiple levels, and just being confident that that's okay. And rather than, you know, sometimes I have conversations with teachers and they go, oh, my year 6s can do this, therefore it's at level 3. And it's like, no, it's at level 4. It's great your year 6s can do it. And so it's really being clear around what the curriculum levels are. And then obviously our kids at different ages are working up and down that scale. And then every section, I think just about, maybe there's one that doesn't, have teaching and learning examples. And so they're not full teaching sequences, they're just a snapshot of the problem bit or a snapshot of the data bit, trying to show you how you might do some of that. And I did originally have links to existing resources, but eventually on Census at School, there'll be a complete page where you can go to and it will tell you like problem, year 1, or whatever there is. And there will be links to existing. There's lots of really good existing material. So I didn't need to put lots of teaching and learning examples in here because they get old. And I need, you know, you need to go to where the current stuff is. And then the last little bit of every chapter is this link to statistical literacy. And I'll show you an example of that towards the end of the talk. So this is now just showing you what's in the book, the high level areas. So everything has a 2.1, which is the introduction, or a 3.1. And so in the problem chapter, we start off with looking at what are the situations for statistical investigations. So that's, summary, comparison, relationship, time series are the big ones that we work with the observational studies at the level we're looking at. And I do touch a little bit on experiments, but not a lot, because we don't do a lot at these year levels. And then we look at investigative questions. So that was my PhD research. So obviously that's a pretty key part of the problem. And then the other bit of problem that we don't often think about is what do we think the data will show? So trying to really encourage students to either predict or conjecture or make a hypothesis about what they think the data will show. Okay, so that's the problem. Then the plan chapter, there's 4 bits to the plan chapter. We've got the methods of data collection. So that's quite a lot of terms. I found this section had quite a lot of the terms that we come off, and you can see there's some of the terms that we might use. Defined ethics, so that's something we hadn't done a lot of, but you will notice that in census at school, ethics we're certainly starting to bring that into the work we do there. And then who to measure, and the who is in inverted commas because the who isn't always a person, it could be an object or even a non-physical entity, and then what to measure and how. So this is going deeply into the planning. And in here we look at collecting data, so primary data collection, and also considering data, secondary existing data sets. And that's becoming a big part of what we do in statistics. With big data and all of that is just so much prevalent in the world out there. And so our students really need to be comfortable with as much working with existing data as they are collecting their own. In the data section, this probably has got nothing new in it, excepting that we don't probably do a lot with data. And so it's just reminding us about how we can get in and think about that data cycle. So I do primary and secondary data. And in there, I've got, I think this is where I've got a whole list of potential data sets you can go and find. Data management. So this is an area we probably haven't done much around. And so thinking about the data behind the data, how we organize data so we can work with it is in there. And then editing or cleaning data. So I've got some probably a bit deeper than many of us have gone in terms of the cleaning data that comes in at curriculum level 5 currently. But sometimes these things aren't necessarily even this is what you have to do with your students. It's about giving you the background knowledge. So you know what, when somebody says, oh, we're going to edit the data or we're going to impute the data, you go, oh, I know what that means now. You don't have to necessarily tell your kids, but it's for you. This is for you to give you some knowledge, some support about what those things are. So analysis is huge. I think David freaked out, that's the publisher, when I told him that the analysis chapter was about 180 pages. And you can go, oh my gosh, it wasn't, the book was meant to be 200 pages and it's not, and we'll talk about a little bit later. But when you sit down and go, what are the visualizations that we do? There were 14 I came up with. And you can't just go, oh, here's the visualization. I've done, I'll talk about that later. I'll come back. But that's one part of the analysis chapter. And then we do describing distribution. So that's the stuff that we do after we've got the visualization. We have to describe it. So I go through all the different types of features we might see in data visualizations, and then a section on reasoning with data. And then the conclusion, that's got 2 parts. So the first part is answering the investigative question. That's what we're doing when we finish the cycle, and then communicating findings and writing reports. And we'll look at that a little bit more. We can talk about that briefly later at the end. Okay, so that's the chapters as they are. So one of the things that might be in a chapter is an overarching big idea. And so, for example, in the planning the chapter on plan, one of the things that I did was I worked with Chris Wilde to create 2 of these that I called Ishikawa diagrams. And they're just a tool to help us think about planning. And the other one is for context analysis, and that comes up a bit later. But this helped me not only to give you something to think about when you're planning, but to structure the chapter. And so the idea is that this is a filled in one, but when you're working with students, you'd start with a blank one. And the first thing you do is you think about, well, are we going to do primary or secondary data and so on? And then who are we going to collect the data from? Are we going to sample? Is it an experiment or an observational study? And then what things are we going to collect? What are our variables? How are we going to measure them? What are they? So those sorts of ideas are in the book. Each chapter has at the start of it what I call indicators, and this to me was the unpacking of the curriculum achievement objectives. And these are unpacked based on what we currently do and what I guess for me would be the vision of where we are going and what's coming up. So they should hold. They should hold for, obviously we've got a curriculum refresh out, and so you can see there that it's like if we look at the plan, it basically says uses the statistical inquiry to conduct investigation. So in years 1 to 3, they're working with a teacher, whereas we get to year 11, they should just be posing their investigative questions themselves. So it sort of is just trying to break that down. And I've done that for every chapter. So instead of it just being one line in the curriculum, it's been unpacked deeply to help us. So sometimes there's definitions. This is just examples of some definitions. So for example, I use the terms categorical and numerical rather than quantitative and qualitative. We just discussed it early on. I discussed it with some of the people in the Stats Ed group, and we thought they just make more sense these days. You know, we've moved away from the quantitative and qualitative, which aren't so necessarily obvious to children and students, whereas categorical and numerical make a lot more sense. And you can see here some of the language, some of the bits are translated into Reo Māori. And the idea when I work with Tony is we want to give the teachers an idea of the language of statistics into Reo Māori. And so, you know, you can start using things like Ngā Taurangi Whakaropo to insert or alongside categorical variables. And so it's a little chance for us to start to bring Te Reo Māori into our statistics as well. So definitions, so where it's appropriate, they're in there. Quite a lot of the stuff I do is around concept development, and particularly in the analysis chapter, I've gone quite deeply into how you might develop the concept of the different graphs. So for example, the first thing I do in any of the data visualizations or the features is I give a bit of a description about what it is and when we might use it. So this is the dot plots one. All right, and then I use for all the data visualizations except for pie graphs. And when you read the book, you'll understand why. I use this thing called ICE-T. So Jerome Bruner has this pedagogical approach, which is we start off with an active, iconic, and symbolic. So we manipulate things, e.g. data cards. Iconic, I'm using that mostly to be the teacher gives the structure, so maybe gives them the grid or the scale for a graph. And then symbolic is when they are creating everything from scratch themselves. So it's sort of that process. And then the T is the technology. And we know that technology is so much of what we do in statistics. So the idea when you go through each of the data visualizations, it gives you an idea of how you might introduce it. And depending on the age of your students, you might already be in the symbolic mode, but if you, with another display, you might be in the inactive mode because it's only just coming in for that age group. So what does it look like? So here's a little bit of an idea. So here's scatter plot. Some of you may remember this from my research back in around 2008. I think I did some work on growing scatter plots. So the idea is that, they build a histogram to start with or a dot plot to start with. And then as they bring in the second variable, they grow. So they actually physically move the data cards up to the place. So they get that idea, hopefully over doing this, is that the shorter heights or right foot lengths, have shorter heights and so on. And the longer right foot lengths have longer heights or taller heights. So that's an example there for scatter plots. And this is just an example of what students might do in terms of starting to build frequency tables. So they might just sort their data, not necessarily even into a comparison of heights by making them lined up, but they sort the data and then they count them. So a frequency table example of an active. And then iconic, so here the structure is given. So this one here is an activity on comparing predicted temperatures with actual values, but the students are given the graph is already set up with the times and the temperatures, and so they are just plotting the data, not just, I mean, that's not as simple as it sounds, but the structure's given to them. And similarly here, they're given a two-way table and then they put the information in it. They're not setting up the two-way table themselves. And then the idea of symbolic. So this one here is an example where the students have set up a frequency table to collect data, measurement data, and then they draw their own graph. And similarly here, data cards, we've all seen them before. So the students are taking the data cards out and then they're recording them on a graph themselves. And I think this one, they might have had a scale, but no numbers. So just a line with some marks on it. So that's what I mean by symbolic. And then we look at the technology. So everywhere there's an example of using technology as well and how you use the technology. So I just want to, so that's the analysis chapter. So that, see that there, this section is 80 pages for just the data visualization. So there they all are. And when you look at the overview, it also tells you the examples, and that may or may not be important for you, but you might think, oh, I just want to explore all the stuff around the Kiwi capers data set or about the Lake Taupo trout. So you can go through and look at those if you're interested. And then here's an example of a features one. Oh, sorry, what I didn't say, I'll just go back here for a minute. What I haven't shown you is for, oh, yes, I have, here it is. In all of these, there is a progression. So every single data visualization, there is a progression about when you would start using it. You don't have to stick to it, but it's sort of based on best fit with our curriculum. And then it connects up to the measures of centre and variation that you would look at in that display. So for example, in time series, we would look at long-term trend and seasonal patterns. And so here, when I come into the concepts for the features, I can see I've got a description, right? So they might not be as long as the data visualizations ones, but we've got a progression here. So in years 7 and 8, we can start to eyeball the middle 50%. And then from years 9 to 10, they're starting to create box plots. We're not wanting years 7 and 8 to make box plots. We're wanting that happens. It's a pretty abstract concept, but we want them to start thinking about the middle 50%. And so that's what that's sort of indicating there. And then it says, what data visualizations might we use to look at the middle 50%? So we might use dot plots or stem and leaf plots or box plots. So it's trying to give you an idea about where these features come up in the visualizations. And then for every feature, I give an example of using that feature in a description. All right. And I don't do lots of examples because we don't have enough room for lots of examples. And this is just how I was thinking on the day, and I may well write it very differently now, but that's what I've tried to do. So there's always an investigative question and a visual, and then there's a description, okay? And your description would probably look really different to mine, and that's great because they should. But hopefully I've modeled in all of them the context, the variable, the group, the values, and the units, all right, as appropriate. This one here, we're just comparing whether they overlap or not. In analysis, these are all the, no, I've gone the wrong way, gone backwards. So when in the analysis, analysis chapter in the describing the distributions for each of the groupings, so I do summary and comparison numerical, summary and comparison categorical, relationship paired numerical, relationship paired categorical, and time series. So 5 different combinations of variables and situations, because categorical and numerical we deal with quite differently, both graphing but also when describing. And these 2 pictures are actually around the wrong way, but for size they fit it on better. So each of them have what I call the distribution description framework. So this was a key piece of work I did in my PhD. And for all of those different ones I've just said, we have contextual knowledge, distributional knowledge, graph comprehension, variability, and signal and noise. These are big overarching concepts in statistics. And then we've got the characteristics such as these. So under contextual knowledge, things like the population or the group, the variable and interpretation and explanation are all part of contextual knowledge. But what does that look like in the description? What's the specific feature we might be talking about? So for example, if I'm talking about the variable, I might be talking about the variable and units. Or if I'm looking at the characteristic of symmetry, I'm thinking about the overall shape of the distribution. Okay, so this is for numerical. Now, if we look at categorical, which I haven't got an example of, there'll be very different things. Mostly we'll see things around proportions rather than means, medians, and modes and things like that. Okay, so each of these frameworks helps us to think about what are the features that are in there. And then with each of the features, I've got some examples of analysis questions. And if you've been to a recent talk or things I've been doing, I've been really focusing on the different types of questions in statistical investigations. And so, investigative questions are the questions we ask of the data collection questions or survey questions are the questions we ask to get the data. I haven't highlighted here, but interrogative questions are sort of ongoing all the way through. So we might interrogate a data set, or we might interrogate our choice of graph that we do. But when we get down to describing our distribution, what we're doing in our head, I think most of the time, is we're asking ourselves analysis questions. In fact, we might even just go, I need to talk about who the data is from, what the population is, what are the groups I'm comparing, what's the variable, are there any units? So these are the questions that are often happening in here. But as teachers, we actually need to verbalize those and help our students think about the analysis questions that they're using to describe the distribution. So these are just examples in here of what you might ask. So if kids have got stuck and you think, oh, they're stuck on spread, so I could say to them, oh, which group is more spread out? Or they could ask themselves, which group is more spread out? And then they can describe that as a feature of the distribution. Not every feature is in every distribution. Not every feature necessarily is important, but at this age, we want to be making sure we're giving them different displays that allow them to see the different features. Okay, so that's there for all of the different variations of the thing. So here's another example. This is a categorical example. So here you can see again, description about what proportions are, talk about the progression, and then what visualizations might help us. And then again, example of using the proportion. So investigative question, the graph, and the description. So that's all the way through that section of the book. So these are all the topics. So you can see here, summary and comparison numerical has these features. And again, examples are there. Summary and comparison categorical has these features. Relationship situations for numerical has these features. Paired categorical, we have proportions, and then time series. All right, so that's the features that are described. And again, there's some little bits of hints in there about how you might teach it. And see, look, 50 pages there. So this is not a small, insignificant part of what we do in statistics. It's not all we do, but it's not an insignificant part. So also in the book, where appropriate, I have examples of research, generally New Zealand-based research that we've done. So for example, here, this is a lot of the work we did with the TLRI grant in 2009 and 2010. That stuff hasn't gone away. It's still as important today as it was back then when we developed it. It's about, in particular, these ones are looking at how we make the call in year 10 and in year 11. And so that stuff is in the book, possibly reminding us, for those of us that were involved and teaching back then, but also for those of us that weren't and maybe haven't got the whole story about how we got to where we are. That story's in the book. It's not a story, but like the journey part and the information we found out. And also there's my doctoral thesis clearly the BB Award is about taking research and writing it up. And so a lot of the book is founded on my doctoral research, but I've included Ann Patel, who's she submitted her PhD and it was accepted last year. So I've got some stuff from hers and other research. So Amanda Rubik's master's research is quoted, for example, amongst others. So I've tried to capture New Zealand stuff as it fitted in with the story of the book and the journey. Sometimes, you don't have definitions and you don't have a conceptual thing. You have to actually describe it through an example. And I am often I've been teaching foundation students this year, so year 13 level, and I've been, just wanting to get my head around some particular concepts. And I'll go to experts and they don't have a definition. Often something's described just in terms of a contextual example. And that's true for this book as well. Some of the contextual examples flow through the book. So the one I'm going to share with you now is one around litter, and I'll talk you through that in a minute. But they kind of flow through each of the chapters. So you can see the sort of the progression or the journey that you might take with that concept or that idea, that context. And then other times that the examples might feel disjointed. They don't necessarily carry on, but they just came up. But you will notice there's things like the litter at the beach, the getting to know your class, the using photographs off the top of my head, Karikari College, Kolwhai, Syndicate, those sort of ones are used throughout the book as examples to do. So here's an example of litter. And so this is in the problem part of the book. So we start right at the front looking at, this is a context we could explore. And this context was actually driven by some work I was doing with some year 1 teachers. And they were really, or year 1 and 2, and they really wanted to do some work around community, and they decided they wanted to look at their local beach. And so we were talking about this. So that idea that they were working with sort of drove the development through the book. And so this, in the book, it just gives you some ideas of things you might be doing at the time with your students. And so this is within the context of the explaining the content. And this one here is carrying on. And you can see here we're looking at using the context analysis diagram and how the teacher might go around, introducing it. There's a book called Duffy's Lucky Escape, that might be a way they do it. And then what you do is you can see it follows through. And this, of course, is my local beach, Titirangi Beach. And this was taken during COVID. So I was writing some of this work during COVID. So I'd go down to the beach on my walk and there would be nobody there because they were all meant to be at home. And so I have these, that's there. So that's about the problem. And then we get into the plan. So we start, you can see here, this is now specifically in a teaching example. So it's at the end of the chapter. So it's years 1 to 3. And so it's talking about the method. So the splits around the method of data collection. This little bit here is about who. So the who in this case is the litter on the beach. So getting kids to think about that. And then what to measure and how. So again, just thinking about what things we might see on the beach and then how we might define them. Land-based activities litter, sea-based activities litter. And then we move into, a little bit more about how we went about doing it. And so here, when we looked at the beach, there wasn't much litter. It was kind of cool. I was pretty happy. But so maybe we look at something different. And so then the question changed. So once we got down there and we had a look at it, things changed. And then we talk about how we might use a grid method to work out how much of the beach is sand and how much of it is shell or plant matter. All right, so that's the sort of stuff that's in the book and the contextual examples that we might use. And then we go into data, and Robin Hedefin and I meet regularly, and we often chat about stuff, and I would be talking about what was going on in my book. And one day we met and she goes, "Do you know about this amazing website called Litter Intelligence?" And I went, "No." And then it was like a whole nother thing I went off on. But, there are some really great existing data sets that we can also look at. So as well as collecting primary data, we might do litter through an existing data set. And so then the story carries on and we start looking at the litter intelligence. And yes, there had been one survey at Titirangi Beach. And so I was able to then develop this into a higher level, so a year 7 to 8 example, where they start looking at the online data set and finding out about the metadata, the data behind the data. And then you can see here, this is the one survey thing. I don't know if you can see it, it's pretty little. And then this is the photograph of the beach that you saw, right? So the car park is there, all right? And in the book, they define very clearly what the different types of beaches are. So I've included some photos that I've taken that you could get kids to check they understand how to classify a beach. So it's a really cool piece of work that Litter Intelligence have done. And hopefully, I was talking to a teacher and her name has just escaped me, but she has actually, from the AMA online we had with Becky last year, I think, she actually got in touch with Litter Intelligence and they've actually engaged in the whole project for their school. So that's really exciting. So there's things like that we can do. So at the end of each of the content sessions, so I've been through that, was the content, is there's a progression. And so remember we had the indicators at the start, which was for the whole chapter. Now the progression is for that little slice of the chapter. So this one here is around data management. And it just depends, sometimes there's only 2 statements, like years 1 to 6 they do this and years 7 to 11 they do that. Other times it's broken down more by the phases of learning that we've got coming out in the new curriculum. So I've made sure that the language is speaking to the language of the new curriculum. And again, here the language of, taonga is there alongside the language of statistics. So trying to get that language available for teachers who teach in te reo Māori. Teaching and learning activities. So the last part of every chapter, there are some teaching and learning activities. This is an example that I did for just getting to understand about the different situations we have, the different types of variables we have, whether they're univariate or bivariate and so on. And I was actually, when I dropped this in, so this is the English version from my draft, and this is the current pretty colour version from the book. It's been through the instructional designer now. And I thought, actually, what I would do, I might not put these investigative questions in, but I think I would throw all these te reo Māori terms in. And so the students can start to work out, what's te reo for relationship, what's te reo for comparison, what's univariate, what's bivariate. And so I think it would be kind of cool. So that's an example of a teaching and learning activity. Mix and match. I've actually also got it, I put it onto Desmos. So I used it with my foundation students this year, and they just move the cards around on Desmos. So there's many ways you can use it. Here's another example of a teaching and learning activity, I think from the analysis section. Now, in a chapter, don't expect to see a fully worked example because I'm trying to highlight the chapter we're working on. So it's only when you get to conclusion you get the fully worked examples, but earlier on you're only getting the part of the cycle we're looking at. So this is an example, I think I showed you the graph earlier, where I'm looking at predicted on the iPhone, predicted at Met Service, and then the actual one. So you can see, problem, plan data, so the information's there, ideas are there. And here's yet another one. So I've dropped this one in here. So Anna Ferguson's Teaching Statistics and Statistics is awesome. What a lovely rabbit hole. I went in and I spent a few days just going and exploring, but I really like this one with the 101 Dalmatians. If you've not seen it, it's a really nice sample. The kids can generate their own sample and then you can do some sample to population work from there. So, your years 9 to 10. And then this is just referencing, many of you will be familiar with the statistical shape work that I did in my PhD. I'm now targeting that at years 7 and 8. That's not to say you don't do it at year 9 and 10 if your students haven't explored it, but we need students to be starting to look at some of this stuff earlier so that by the time we get them in high school, we're not having to teach everything. And so that big driver for me behind the book was how well can we support everyone through that chain up to year 11, so that actually in 12 and 13, we aren't doing so much catch up, that we can actually work on the big ideas that come in at 12 and 13. And I never wanted to do 12 and 13. That would be a whole book in itself. All right. So this is all about this sort of foundational stuff up to that point. Okay. So statistical literacy. In every chapter, I've made the link to statistical literacy, and all I've got in there, I haven't done much with it, but we looked at what would be the worry questions at year 9 and 10, because that was by year 9 and 10, we're starting to look at all aspects of the cycle. So this one here, for example, is for plan. And so these are just some examples of the worry questions you might ask around plan. Now, if you're working with year 5 and 6 students, you might look at it and go, which ones of those are appropriate for year 5 and 6 students? Or if you're working with year 1 students, you look at it and say, which ones of these can I use for my year 1s? This is a broader list for year 9 and 10. So how big is the book? It's big. It's big. It's about 420 pages. It's 414 at the moment, and I think the index, which I did the other day, will be about 6 or 7 pages. Every chapter, when you get into it, has at the start of the chapter a contents page. So this is the conclusions contents page. And also right after the contents page is this overview picture. And you will recognize this because I'd snipped this part as what I shared earlier. And that just shows you the introduction has the indicators. We then have the content sections, be they 2, 3, or 4. What's in the content sections? This here pretty much aligns with this here. If there is an example, a data set that's used, then that's italics, you can see here. Reaction time and favourite learning area, rooms 30 and 31, getting to know the class, ladybirds and kiwi capers. Those are the data sets of the examples. Then there's progressions, then there's teaching and learning ideas, and here it lists the teaching and learning ideas. So I think this is the only one that I don't have an example in, and then the statistical literacy link. So the idea is that each chapter, you can go in and at the front, you've got that high level overview, and also in the introduction, all of these overviews are there together. So from plan through to conclusion are there together. And there is an index. As I say, I was doing the index on Friday. Oh, that was yesterday. All right, so there is an index, and again, that will help you. So there's lots of ways to get around the book. How to use the book. So this is my, this is actually my edit. This is me going through and checking for things that needed to be corrected. So this is my proof, my first full proof. You can see it's a biggish book. But how do you use it? I don't care how you use it, just use it. But I think it's something you're going to go in and out of. I don't think you're going to sit down and read it from the beginning to the end. In fact, if you do, you're crazy, because it's not designed for that purpose. I want you to write in it. You know, I want you to get a book and I want it to be yours, and I want you to write in it. And so you might be reading something and think, oh, I've got a really cool activity, blah, blah, blah. And you just write it in the book. It's yours. When I met with the teachers who did the reviewing for me, I'd turn up and their books looked worse than that, like the number of tags they had. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's so much feedback. They go, no, this isn't feedback. This is all the stuff I've already identified that I want to come back to. And so that's really what I guess I want you to do, is I want you to use it for your thing. Make it dog-eared, have stickies, highlights, make it work for you. It's for you to help you grow your knowledge and about statistics. And I certainly grew mine in the process of writing it.